thank you, Valerie, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. So I'm here. Before we get started, I would like you to look at the 4 pictures that we're going to see right now, and try to think of something those pictures could have in common. Just one. So the point of this is that they all make me think, hey, what kind of bats can I find here? And so these are all taken from UAE, of course, but the same reasoning applies to much broader areas. So yes, they don't have control. Are you trying to set up the other one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yep. Next one. Okay. Before we go on to, so can you get to, yes. So one thing that I really like about bats is everything we don't know about bats, which kind of sounds a little bit weird, but I find that because there's so many questions that still need answering, there's kind of really great places to just have some wacky projects. And so I showed the picture of the Burj Khalifa just a minute ago. So when I saw that structure, I thought, hey, how can we use this structure to maybe record bats at, say, 500 meters altitude? Because recording bats altitude is challenging at best of times. But hey, if there's a structure that goes that tall, maybe we can use that. And then just the more I stay in the region, the more, can I sit? Might be easier. Yes. Okay. As we all know, summers here get pretty hot. How hot is too hot for bats? Because there's been quite a bit of research, for example, in Europe on a species of bat called the Jeffroy's bat. And we know that hot summers in Western Europe, which is not that hot, but those hot summers lead to high mortality in that species. But here, those are winter temperatures. So how come we still find the species here, and how does it adapt to hot temperatures? How dry is too dry? It's the same. It's the other side of the question. How far do bats fly? Because if you have a large desert area, obviously they're not roosting in the desert itself. They're roosting in some kind of structure, natural or not, somewhere, but they probably have to travel some distance to find water. We also know that densities of prey is pretty low in sand, because it's sand. So how far do they travel in a night to get enough energy to survive? So there's all these questions that are completely unanswered in the region. And so that is really why I'm so interested in bats and just keep working with it. Now, my journey didn't start in UAE. It started near a little town called Chimay in Belgium that you might know from a certain day, with this bat. And so I was invited to go catching some bats with a local bat group. And I jumped on that opportunity, and bats have never left me since. Bats have taken me all around the world. So Mexico, India, Costa Rica, South Africa, Kenya, Malaysia, Thailand. As part of a massive world tour I did in 2019, and I had a single question on my mind is, what kind of bats can I find here? So I went to random places. I went to places where I knew there were bats. I knew what was there, but I also went to places where I didn't know what was there. And I always wanted to know what bats are there. So naturally, when I landed in UAE, I thought, hey, maybe I can do the same here. I started reading up on the literature. I found this paper with a map showing every single record of bat in the country. I thought, okay, if you can plot every single record in the country, it's a bad start. And so I thought, okay, there might actually be a lot of places that someone could go to and try to discover more about bats. And so after that, I decided to settle here, and that way I had more time to spend on this. And then I also looked at distribution maps. So this is the map for the naked-bellied tombbat. This map, to anyone who's got 2 working brain cells and a little bit of ecology understanding, doesn't make any sense. Having such a patchy distribution on a species that is such generalist is highly unlikely. And it is messing data in lots of places. So it is obviously present in UAE, including in Dubai itself, in the city. It is found throughout North Africa. Basically, it's found in a lot more places than this. And so, but this sort of reinforced my belief that there's a lot that we don't know, and basically any kind of furthering of that knowledge that we can get is beneficial to our understanding of those bats. And so I started my journey with bats in UAE. I did some trapping. So this is the most common species in UAE. It's the cool pipistrelle. It's, if you've seen bats in UAE, it's probably this one, unless it was in a tunnel somewhere in the mountains, in which case it's something else. But if it was, say, flying around here, that one. Interestingly, some of them are very yellow. Don't really know why, but not all of them look like that. So cool pipistrelle is a species that is found sort of throughout Europe, North Africa, and then extends well into Western and a little bit into Central Asia. They don't always look this yellow, so maybe there's something going on there. I don't know. But it is by far the most common species. Then we have some more, some less common species. This is the Sind bat, or Rhinopithecus nasutus. Anything that has a name that includes nasutus means it has a funny nose. This one does indeed have a funny nose. This doesn't seem to be particularly common, but still quite widespread in UAE. And then we have something like the botaceratine, which is bigger. It doesn't look that much bigger, but it is quite a bit bigger than Quilly we just saw. There's a few different ways we can survey bats. One is trapping, and that is the only way to get the pictures I just showed. Or there's acoustic. Acoustic consists at recording bats and then looking at the screen either on the field or in the field or later on the computer. But either way, there's a screen involved and a lot less handling of the bats. There's other ways you can trap bats. So I just showed a oh, this works. Oh, this is nice. This is a mist net. It's probably the sort of cheapest way of trapping bats, but there's also heart traps. The system of heart trap is actually quite simple. It's a series of banks that have fishing lines, and the bats just fly through them. At some point, they fall down and they sit nicely in a little bag at the bottom. It's a lot less stressful for them than something like a mist net, where they'll get entangled, stress out, and then to be handled for quite a while to be extracted without injuries, which adds to the stress. It's just that the surface area is a lot smaller, so we can't just use heart traps. Also, this thing is about 15 kilos. So if you want to carry multiple of those on your back for a night trapping away from the car park, it's a bit of a challenge. And this is I think it's a common noctule from in England, just to show that sometimes bats don't go in the pocket, sometimes they just stay there, but it's just to show it's a lot less stressful than a mist net. Other ways to survey bats is to find a roost. But the issue in UAE is that we don't know many roosts. In fact, for most species, we don't even know what kind of roost they would use. We can make assumptions based on what they do in other regions, but specifically the geological context, for example, is quite different. So any cave roosting bats, there's not many large caves in the mountains. They're mostly small caves, crevices, things like that. Even the crevices depends on where you are, because some of the rocks. I'm not a geologist by any stretch, but I can see differences in rocks, and I can see how this affects bats. But I have no way of quantifying or qualifying this further. But this is a tunnel in Saudi Arabia, for example, because I don't have a picture of the tunnels in UAE that have bats. It's a very similar species of bat though, called a mouse-tailed bat, called that way because it has a very long tail. So that's why I said if you've seen a bat in a tunnel in UAE, it's probably something like this. Roosts can be basically anything. Roosts in rocks are incredibly diverse. You have anything from crevices to boulders, tunnels, caves. This is taken in Seychelles to show another kind of formation. This is considered to be the rarest bat species in the world. This is about 5% of the world population, which is always sad when you can say this about a single picture. Now, UAE specifically, or just the region in general, have their own unique challenges when it comes to finding roosts. The biggest one is, if you go through the literature for most of the bat species found here, it's going to say rock crevices. So this is one such rock crevice. But then a lot of the UAE looks like this. So there's probably millions of rock crevices in there. Good luck finding the handful that will have bats in them. And so that is really the challenge in a lot of the arid areas, is there's no obvious caves that you can go to. There's no large trees that have nice openings in them, which you might expect to contain bats in Europe, for example, or in North America. So really it's just rocks. And so this makes looking for bats inside roosts very challenging. So we are left with the third method, which is acoustics. Now, I did want to go a little bit I wanted to go over the kind of main differences between trapping and acoustics, just to show why I chose to specialize in acoustics and why I think a lot of the work that can be done in UAE can be done using acoustics. The first thing you can do with trapping is you actually have an individual in your hand. That means you can age it, you can sex it, you can identify perhaps subspecies, things like that. The reproductive status as well, so you can see if it's lactating, pregnant, all these things that you wouldn't know unless you had it in your hand. You also get a sense of density, because if you catch 15 of the same species in an hour, it's probably quite common, or you just happen to be just outside the roost. There is a bit of bias there. It can be useful, for example, if you know a roost, you just want to know what's inside, then you can just set up a net or hat trap, catch those, look at a few individuals, and then close up everything and just leave. So you don't disturb everyone in the roost. It also allows you to ID species in a far broader context. So earlier at dinner, we were talking about a species that is found on Socotra and also in Somalia. But the western end of its distribution isn't known. We just know that there's something else that starts, and that is found in Eritrea. So somewhere in between those two countries, there's a line where those two species sort of either meet or just replace each other. In the hand, they are readily identifiable. Acoustically, we don't know, because we don't have enough recordings from either side. So if you wanted to do some research on those, you can't do that with acoustics. And if we take specifically the UAE, there's a few species that have recorded, and other people have recorded as well. We don't know what they are, because the calls are weird. We have hypotheses, but unless we have it in the hand, we can't know for sure what it is. Because I'll go on to reference calls in a minute, but that is kind of the main issue we have. Also, usually taxonomy goes a lot faster than reference call collection. So, for example, Europe has now exploded in terms of number of species for a certain number of groups. We kind of still assume that the calls are the same, because we don't have specifics. One really interesting thing that I would love to do here is radio tracking. So that consists of just putting a teeny tiny tag on the back of a bat, letting it go, and then running after it to see where it goes. This is useful to look at roosts, but less so in rock formations. So again, that's a bit of a problem here when everything seems to be roosting in rocks. But it could, for example, be very interesting in figuring out how far certain bats go into the desert, for example. How far are they willing to go for water? How far would they travel in a night to feed? Things like that. There is a bit of a bias because nets and traps are put usually at ground level. Sometimes when you have things like bridges, you can go a little bit higher and go a little bit MacGyvery and have some very wonky and sketchy constructions to catch higher flying species but anything that flies sort of 20 meters and above ground is going to be very hard to catch. Acoustics, on the other hand, and that's really the main point for me, is it's non-invasive. Okay, you can put a recorder somewhere, the bats don't even know it's there, and quite like that because it does make a lot of the logistics easier, both in terms of permitting and also I showed a picture of a bat in Seychelles. I don't have to worry about potentially harming the rarest bat species in the world when I'm just putting recordings in random places. Whereas if I were to catch the bats inside that, the biggest roost known for that species, I don't know what kind of long-term effect that would have on those bats. Also quite time-saving because you don't actually have to spend every evening out in the field to sample. You can do two really interesting things that I think are really interesting, because knowing what bats are in a given location is fine. It's interesting. But to me, it always just opens more questions than it answers. It's kind of the base, the first step, and then every other step you need far more work to answer. And so what you can do with recorders is, for example, I have this plan of having 3 recorders in different areas of UAE that will run for an entire year. And then I should be able to see if there's any differences between winter and summer. Is there potentially seasonal movements, things like that. You can't, it's harder to do with trapping because bats are pretty smart. Once you've caught one once, you're unlikely to catch it. Now, there's always some less smart bats. And so there are individuals that you will occasionally catch 4 times in an evening. They really don't get the memo. But generally, you can expect that the more you sample a location with trapping, the less likely you are to catch the bats that you've already caught. And so this makes any kind of long-term monitoring a little bit challenging because you know you're always working with this bias. Obviously, it allows for large-scale studies. I could conceivably decide to sample the whole of UAE using acoustic recorders. I just need enough of them. There is no way I can trap in a significant number of locations to do that with trapping. And then finally, the flip side of the high-flying bat species is actually you do record more of those because they tend to be louder, but you don't record the quiet species, which you might be more likely to catch. So really what you want is both, because they do different things. For a species list, both is ideal. If you want to go a little bit further, usually one will kind of suit your project better. I've been talking a lot about acoustics, but I haven't actually explained what it is that I'm doing. So, as Valerie explained, echolocation is a mechanism where a bat will emit a sound that we can't hear, usually. It will bounce off something and then come back, and the bat will... The only information the bat has is the time gap between the time the sound was emitted and when it comes back. It's all the information it has. And somehow with that, it does do it a lot of times per second, just for clarity. But with that, it is able to have a picture of its environment, and it is able to catch mosquitoes at night, which is quite impressive. So bats aren't blind, but like I like to say is, I don't know if you've tried to catch a mosquito in the dark at night. It's not that easy, and you're not blind. So it's just sight is close to useless at night, especially when you're flying 25 kilometers an hour trying to catch insects that fly a little bit less than that. This is where echolocation comes in. So it is, in a way, it is seeing with sound, but it's not. So our vision, and vision is generally continuous. We don't have gaps, but bats obviously do have gaps because these sounds are discrete emissions. In between those gaps, it is blind. One thing I would like to get out of the way quite quickly is we are talking about calls here. So you might think, oh, it's a little bit like identifying birds or frogs by calls. It's not. And first thing, I think bats are a lot cooler than birds and frogs. No offense to anyone, but that's... But then the main point really is that birds and frogs and crickets and any sound-making individual outside of dolphins emit sounds to communicate. So the purpose of the sound that they are emitting is identifying themselves. So you would expect it to be quite good at identifying themselves. However, echolocation is not that. Echolocation is all about navigation. So that means the bat needs to change its calls and how often it calls, all these things to adapt to its environment. So as it gets close to obstacles, mentioned earlier that it is blind in between calls. So as it's getting close to a rock face, it might want to increase the frequency of those calls just to avoid hitting said rock face. So you'd expect the variation between those calls to be mostly dictated by environmental factors. Could be habitat, could be how close it is to obstacles, could be humidity levels even, could be the type of prey it is going after, all these things. Whereas for bird calls, frog calls, whatever, if they start modulating their calls too much, no one will understand them. And then suddenly it stops being useful. Because if your call isn't understood by anything or anyone, it's no longer communication. So this is really important. Basically, the short of it is echolocation call variation is not infinite, but close to it. Whereas variation within a single species or within a single subspecies, it is generally contained, at least within a given population. There's these examples where you've got bird songs. We have the chaffinches often used as an example in Europe, because you'll see accents where the calls change slightly. But even that is relatively limited, and it is region locked. Whereas bat calls, you could record the single bat across many nights. You will have 2,000 different calls, which you wouldn't expect with other species. Now, what is a reference call? Because we do need those to identify a bat species in the first place, okay? We have a bat, okay? The bat is a known species. So somehow you've identified a bat, either because you've caught it or because you found a roost that only has the one species. Either way, you know what species the bat is that you are recording. You're making a recording of it, you're analyzing it, you are labeling the recording, and then you add it to a nice, neat little library of reference calls where each call is each call sequence is associated with a species. What it is then used for is you have an unknown bat that you are recording somewhere else. You make a recording, you analyze it, and then what you will do is quite simply just compare that to the references that you've collected before. Or more realistically, what the references that others have collected before. The issue with bats, many places around the world, but we're talking about Western Asia here, so here is we don't have this. So if you don't have this step, this whole thing kind of falls apart. Because you are recording a lot of calls and you have nothing to compare them to. It would be a little bit like if you were to try to identify birds without any kind of field, any kind of description of what the bird looks like. You have in front of you a little brown bird that is skulking through a bush, and there isn't a single guide available for that. This is kind of the situation we're in here. So this step, or this kind of first series of steps, is rarely required because, say, you want to work on acoustics in Europe. There's a couple of fantastic books, pick those up, you're good to go. It'll take you a number of months before you've got the hang of it, but at least you can get started. Same in the US, although there isn't a single book yet, which is baffling, but anyway, there's books in other places, but the point is we are lacking this data for a lot of species. And so my work in UAE and the region at large has really been to collect reference calls for this library. Now, without going too much into detail about bat sound analysis, because I could go on for hours, these are kind of roughly drawn bat calls, okay, individual calls. Now we'll start by saying there's kind of two ways you can identify calls. There is the way you would expect, which is by listening to them. I'll let you in a little secret. I can't stand the sound of bat calls. Okay, just I can't. Gives me a headache. So instead, what you can do is look at a screen and turn your sound off, or listen to some nice music or podcast. And what you do is visually identify calls. Now, I'm joking about this, but you can absolutely identify sound by sound. And that's been incredibly well developed in Europe, Western Europe specifically, for example. A lot of the French bat workers will use mostly sound. I learned it that way. I've also, the main thing I've learned is to not trust my ears, because I realized I was basically hearing what people wanted me to hear with the training. As soon as I realized that, I thought, okay, this is not reliable. For me, it's not reliable. So that's when I moved on to purely visual. And so visual is not just, hey, look, it's a nice shape, 3 different shapes here, but it's also going to consist in taking a series of measurements. So these are the 3 kind of basic ones, but there's a bunch more that you can make, where you start measuring frequencies at different points of the call. You would also measure the duration. So frequency would be your y-axis, and then your x-axis would be time. Yeah, we're going back to school with graphs and math and things. And then you would basically compare these parameters to a table like this one. And that is often the way reference data is presented in the literature. I said earlier that bat call variation is not infinite, but close to it. So you would expect, okay, if we say this is the whole range for the start frequency, end frequency, peak frequency, you would expect all these combinations of values to be possible, because we said it was pretty much infinite. It's not. A lot of those parameters will be correlated with each other. For example, duration is kind of the main one you can use to describe what a bat is doing, because the closer it is going to get to an obstacle, the shorter the call is going to become, and then the more call it's going to make. Okay. It's also going to increase its volume. So the bat is just going to shout louder. This has physics implications in terms of the air pressure in the throat, and that is going to increase basically all the frequencies. So just because the bat wants to reduce the duration, other things are going to change. This doesn't tell you any of this. And so you can also use reference spectrograms. And there's kind of 2 different kinds of spectrograms you can use. This one is just an example of a sequence. Okay, this is just a real bat that I recorded, and it made those calls, and I just compare this to an unknown sequence. Or, and that's something I picked up from a colleague, a couple of colleagues actually in the UK. It's called a compiled sequence, and this is really what I'm proud to be bringing to UAE, if I can call it that. But I think it is a very useful reference type that could do with being more popular among people who use calls, acoustic, sorry. And what this does basically, so these are individual calls from real sequences, but in multiple sequences. And what this does basically, it's a snapshot of the diversity of what a species can do. Okay, the shortest calls on the left, the longest calls on the right. And so depending on the context, a bat might do calls that look more like the ones on the left, or more like the calls that are on the right. As you can see from this example, there's similarities, but you can see the differences. Okay, and so this is actually really useful when you want to try to encapsulate the diversity of a species repertoire. Now, once we've made these references, we can then use those references to actually identify bats. But to do that, we also need to make recordings of bats. And so there's lots of different kinds of recorders that you can use, but essentially the 2 main categories are active recorders You might recognize this one from the a previous slide. Active recorders mean that you are walking around with your device and you are going to different places. This involves you staying late at night, potentially risking your life on the side of a very busy road for no good reason. Or you could do the safer thing, which is not perfect. It has its challenges. This has a lot of value. But this is also the lazy approach, which I like. Or not lazy, so efficient. Efficient is the word. This involves leaving a bat recorder, a static bat. So this is a self-contained unit that gets triggered as a bat flies by. It records it, goes to sleep, gets triggered again when another bat flies by. Or the same one just does loops around the recorder and fills up your cars in 3 days. It's, you know. And so what you can do with that is, you remember earlier I was talking about long continuous monitoring or repeated sampling. This is perfect for that, okay? The one issue in UAE, tiny issue, is the heat. I've discovered that in UAE, I can get about half of the manufacturer's claimed battery life. Generally, manufacturer claims in this industry, pretty accurate. But in UAE, I get about half that. So whenever I see, okay, this one can do 50 nights. Okay, so that's 25 nights in UAE. Okay. It does make year-long monitoring quite a bit more challenging because some recorders in more reasonable temperatures can do 100 nights. It's still not 100 in UAE. So it would still involve me doing quite a bit of back and forth to swap cars and batteries. Generally around here, the batteries are the issue, cars. And so what this does is just record continuously, well, triggered, but night after night. It turns on automatically at sunset, turns off automatically at sunrise. Fantastic. And then collect it after X many days. Or you can do a hybrid approach, which I quite like doing, especially when it comes to collecting reference calls. I'll use one of these very expensive microphones. It's one of the best microphones for bats. That doesn't cost 7 months of salary. And so I'll use that. I'll set it up somewhere and record bats in a specific area. I'll leave this sometimes for an entire night to just come pick it up in the morning if I know it's safe from humans. And so there's kind of a hybrid approach in that I can leave it for the night, still get some sleep, but still get some data. If you're curious about the tablet, there's a thermal imaging camera there that allowed me to film bats flying over this wonderful pond that I used to live near just a few years ago. I missed this pond, it was a nice pond. And here are a few of the recorders I own. I have a bit of a problem since there's been more. But the point is there's a lot of different kinds that you can get. And I often get the question, hey, what recorder should I buy? Or what is the best recorder? And the reason I have so many isn't just because I have a problem. I have a justification for that problem. So each of those recorders will do certain things better than others, or do other things worse than others. And so as I also do coaching and online training, it's useful for me to understand the weaknesses and strength of each device. Also, one thing you realize is a lot of them are very expensive. So most people will only have experience with a single device. So naturally, this is the one they will recommend to others. But there's an inherent bias in this. And so I do enjoy the ability to compare things and actually be able to give a balanced opinion and suggestion to people. So you've got from the cheapest one would be this one, but this one has some sound quality issues. This one is also very cheap, but you do have to spend a couple of hours soldering it yourself. It's not for everyone. This one, I don't believe it is made anymore. It was made by a fantastic bloke in the UK. Got this one, by far the most popular bat recorder out there. It's a little USB microphone that you can plug into your smartphone. It comes with a great app, so you can be up and running in no time. This one is spectacularly expensive and runs on ancient Android, which I don't like. And then we've got this one, which is one of the passive recorders I mentioned earlier. All the other ones are all active, so you have. So this one's also passive. The other ones you have to walk around with. And so I thought it was also useful to go over the workflow, because recording the bats is really the easy bit. Just put a box out in the wood somewhere, come back to pick it up. It's not rocket science. The rocket science comes in later. So once you get the data, you back it up and then use a state-of-the-art computer machine to generate spectrograms. And then with this, you're going to end up with a beautiful spreadsheet where you will associate each recording with a species and a timestamp, things like that. This is kind of the second analysis, because the first analysis is identifying the bats. The second one is but what does it mean? This is really the question that you're trying to answer. Is I have these names associated with file names. Regular people can't do anything with this. Only crazy people can use this. So what the crazy people would do is, for example, tell you, hey, most activity is early at night, because once you have an Excel spreadsheet, you can start with some stats. And so you'll see, okay, there's a really significant peak very early in the evening around sunset. So perhaps that might indicate that there's a roost nearby, because the bats haven't had the chance to travel very far. So if there is a lot of activity around sunset, it means the roost is probably quite near the recording. Things like that are sort of a step further than, oh, this recording is this. The process of identifying bat sequence is as diverse as the calls are themselves, but it usually starts with looking at the sequence. Okay, what kind of trends am I seeing? What kind of patterns? What kind of overall shape? These are basically sticks. Okay, we all agree that they're sticks. And then what I will usually do is try to define the sticks a little bit better. So they start really high because they break my screen there, and they end relatively high for bats. Because most bats tend to sort of operate in this 20 to 40 kilohertz range. We can hear bats up until the bit I've cut. Or with this recording, for example, okay, there's quite a bit of things happening. This looks relatively neat, and then there's whatever this is, and then whatever this is, and I'll start to sort of puzzle things to piece by piece. Try to, okay, is this one individual? Is this two individuals? Is this one species? Is this two species? In this case, it is one species, two individuals. This one is the social call. I haven't touched about social calls at all, but remember that slide about bats and frogs or birds? Bats also do have calls that are there to communicate with other bats. And that's a whole other conversation. Really interesting one, but this is really, so echolocation description is already quite cutting edge. Social calls is past the cutting edge. I don't know what that's called, but it's over the edge. Because there's so much we don't understand, even in regions that are heavily studied, like Europe or North America. So I've just decided to draw some examples of bat call shapes there. So I'll start looking at curves. Is there a bend? Is the bend actually more of an angle than a bend? Where is the bend? Things like that. But often I'll be looking at this. And so I've shown you really nice spectrograms there where the call is really clearly defined, where each of those sticks is, come on, man, really defined. You can see, you can see where it starts, you can see where it ends. There's no fuzziness to it. So other way. This is all about fuzziness. And this happens when the recording quality isn't good enough. First thought might be, probably the microphone wasn't good enough. It's rarely the case. Most recordings on the market are more than good enough for high quality recordings. Usually this happens when there's interference. So the frequency that we use, or even that bird songs use, if the bird is on the other side of a tree, you can still hear it, because the frequencies will go through the tree without a problem. The high frequencies will hit obstacles such as leaves. And so this means that the sound will quickly degrade. And what you'll get is, this is basically the equivalent of someone calling your name across a busy street. The sound is still there. It's just unusable. And so this is what you'll get a lot of when recording bats. And this is arguably, after references, it's the biggest challenge to this. And so I said earlier that what got me really excited about acoustic work in UAE is building those references. At the bottom, we've got coarse pipistrelle. At the top, we've got Sind bats. So those are two of the bats that I showed at the very beginning of the presentation. I knew going into this, acoustically, they were very similar. Most references I could find said they were identical. I had my doubts because a lot of times when we say things are identical, 20 years later, we realize actually, no, they're not identical. We just needed some crazy people to spend far too many hours on actually trying to find the differences. And so that's what I did. And I looked at dozens of sequences of each, actually hundreds of sequences of each species and now my answer is yes, sometimes in certain cases, maybe on a Tuesday, you can identify the species based on echolocation. It's very subtle things. So I showed earlier parameters and the table. You might think comparing numbers is a lot easier. Numbers are exactly the same for both. You can look at tables, you can do all the stats you want. You will not get any kind of statistically significant parameter difference. But it's subtle, cool-shaped differences where they both kind of look like hockey sticks, but this one has a sharper bend here than those. Okay, and that's really where it's at. I won't go into detail, but because I would in my online courses I go into more examples. But I wanted to show this example just to show that sometimes it really comes down to things as minute as this bend is sharper than this other bend. And so where we're at now is I have sampled quite a few locations. Most of the blue dots, not all of them. Some of the yellow dots, I really need some more consistency in my dots. Also, some of the hearts are okay. Yeah, this is a mess. But anyway, lots of locations is kind of the point of this map. Lots of locations in the north of UAE. A lot fewer down the south. These have nothing to do with bats. And so really one point I would like to make with this talk is that this is just, I'm just one person. I am working with other people. But it's still a very small contribution to a massive project. So it's going to take years. Colleagues and I have already found new species using acoustics, not new species to science, but new species to UAE, potentially to science, but that would require genetics. And I expect some more. If you compare the diversity of UAE to Northern Oman, for example, there's a few species that are missing, but we are finding the same ecological features on this side of the border, so it doesn't really make sense that they wouldn't cross the border because bats. Most places in UAE don't have any bat records whatsoever. You remember the map I showed at the start with the review from 2015? That was actually able to plot the 35 or so records we had. Obviously, there's more now with acoustics, but it's still nowhere near comprehensive enough. I have this long-term plan of having a UAE bat atlas, which would be great. And then there's all these questions that I've had. Other people might have a lot more questions. These are kind of the ones I want to look at. So is there seasonal variation? Does it vary between species? Is it just, bats are less active in the summer? Or is it, this bat species is less active, this one doesn't seem to care? Is there migration? I know there's some speculation that in other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, we might have some migration. Could there be some migration across the Strait of Hormuz, for example? Things like that. Also, I like to spend time on Google Maps satellite view, just looking at areas. Hey, this looks nice. Could it have bats? Again, same question. I'll really only have one question in my head. What about farms? Because farms in the desert are creating a habitat that is potentially suitable for bats in an area where there wasn't any, or at least limited resources. So by providing this extra food, what has that done to the bats in the south of UAE? Coastal habitats. I've helped WWF with analysis in the mangroves, but I know I've sampled mangroves in Australia, for example. Huge diversity. There's a few bat species that are mostly found in mangroves, rarely elsewhere. So there could be things in UAE as well where certain bat species are mostly found in mangrove habitats. There's a lot of mountains. Is there a difference in terms of altitude? How does altitude link with seasonal variation? Perhaps in the lowlands we get more variation than we do in the highlands. A whole bunch of questions that hopefully one day we'll have an answer. So thank you very much. I took the liberty of plugging in my book. I mentioned the world tour I did in 2019. This is that. It's got loads of pictures, loads of stories. It's written in the same style as the talk I just gave, because this is what I do. I haven't made it overly scientific. I haven't made it sound like not me. My editor kept it as me. So it is definitely not aimed at bad experts. It's anyone who's got a remote interest in nature, basically. So yeah, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Leslie did a trip again to the Bangladesh in Hatt.
Yes.
And where the openings are very often you can see in the original route, a lot of it's very sanitized and you're looking through a well-lit corridor. But there were lots of bats roosting in there.
Yes.
I guess you didn't like.
I haven't been yet. I need to go in the next few days because just so happens that I need pictures of that bat species. So this would be the muscat mousetail bat. I don't have enough pictures of mousetail bats, but it's very distinctive in the way it hangs off a wall, because we all know that our bats hang upside down by their feet. If you look careful, the rhinopomas, the mousetail bats, they always hang on a wall, okay, with their thumbs and feet. So they're always against surfaces. Well, sometimes they hang freely, but it's quite rare. And also they have a really, really long tail. I have a really nice picture of one on me when I visited a lab in Tel Aviv, where they have a small captive population. And they just stay on you because they need a certain height to take off, a little bit like swifts. You can put swifts in your hand, they won't take off because they'll just fall down. So it's quite funny to see them actually hang like this. But yes, that would be the species that's there. I've heard that some of the guides say that they're fruit bats, but they're not fruit bats. There are fruit bats in UAE. There's one, Egyptian fruit bat, but that's not it. Yeah. Yep.
Question on recordings of the bats, like the ones you that you tell me, I guess recordings done in captive management and the comparative, like how that compares to, I guess, wild populations. Do you notice a linguistical difference, or are they just kind of your basis for, hey, here's all the samples we've gathered from captive populations and we're taking this data to try to figure out what's out there?
So it's kind of, this is actually there's a lot of parts to this question. But the first thing is there's not that many species found in captivity. Most of the time it's fruit bats because they're easier to feed. Just give them mango and then they're happy. Sometimes they decide they don't like mango anymore, they want melon, but other than that, it's relatively simple. True story, by the way, but yeah. Insect-eating bats are a lot harder to keep in captivity. So they're rarer. There are some cases where I mentioned there's this lab in Tel Aviv, there's other labs in the US that keep a population for a certain period of time to do specific studies. And so one such studies was to look at individuals calls, because what we do here is, while I can say in a single sequence, this is a single individual, if I record 5,000 sequences, I can't say how many individuals there are. I can only say this sequence has 1, maybe 2, maybe 3. Past that, it's too messy to count. But in between sequences, you can't link the individuals. So what they were trying to do with those captive populations is determine whether each individual had its own signature and how this changed as other bats called nearby. It was the whole thing. And so the issue you run into with those is, I mentioned earlier that bats will modulate their calls based on proximity to obstacles. You can imagine that a bat that is used to be in the open landscapes that we have here won't do well inside an enclosed volume, even if, say, you've got 20 meters wide or something, which is already logistically quite complex to make. It will still feel, for certain species, will still feel that obstacles are very close, because it might be a bat that is used to flying at 50 kilometers an hour. Those 20 meters, it's going to hit them very fast. And so this is also an issue we run into when recording reference calls, is because what people will sometimes do is use flight tents, set up a tent of varying sizes, depending on what you have available, and record the bat inside there, because you've caught it, you know exactly what it is, release in there, get the calls. But those will only be calls that a bat would produce, first, in a situation of stress, second, in a situation where obstacles are very close. If you are then trying to compare these calls with free-flying bats, they won't match, because they are taken in very different environments. So it's kind of a long way of saying it really varies on the environment that the bats were recording in, but for most species, it's just not realistic to rely on captivity. As a side note, in the UK, they've started doing a lot of work on recording small mammals, so small rodents, shrews, all these that you will record with bat recorders. I lied to you earlier, by the way, when I said that bat recorders are only triggered by bats. They're triggered by anything that's ultrasonic. So this would be insects, this would be small mammals, other things, cars, yeah. And for that, captivity works really well. So especially for things like shrews, they're relatively rare in captivity, but sometimes they are held in captivity. And because they do call in the wild, but if you catch a single one, and even if you keep it overnight, it's unlikely to call. You need multiple for them to call each other, basically. And so this is kind of the way they found, is that they went to different zoos around England and recorded them in there. So that seemed to have worked for those mammals. For bats, I don't think it's as viable an option, unfortunately. Yeah.
I want to just show you the photos of that one on Polish.
Yes, so that would be a baby mouse-tail bat, yes.
Mouse tail?
Yes. Yes, that is a baby.
And this one is not identified. Somebody was identifying them as Jeffrey something.
It looks,
It's not.
I mean, it is hanging weird. It is naked, which is what is.
No, this one.
Yeah.
But this what you see, this is the name which somebody was identifying it.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if it's the correct one.
I mean, that one is in UAE as well.
Polish here in Hatta, this is the one which
Okay.
Alisa was asking about.
Interesting.
Because when we went there, we saw a lot of them there. So
Okay.
it's not
The
UAE.
pictures I've seen were of mouse tails, but I'm having that's about.
I know why it's not
yeah.
working.
So
Maybe later I will show you.
maybe we can post these with the identification onto the
Yeah.
website. So Faisal on the Zoom has offered to share recordings and photos and map locations from the mountain areas.
Yeah.
Maybe we could bring him online now or afterwards. It'll probably be easier afterwards, but
Okay.
right. So we've got an
Yeah,
offer
I
there.
mean, it's gonna take a lot of people to get to a reasonable knowledge of bats of the UAE, and it definitely helps when people are willing to share data. Yes, because that can sometimes be a bit of an issue. Yes.
You alluded that let's say the collaborative or the mating signals or just the behavioral patterns between bats isn't studied as well. Maybe it's beyond the bleeding edge, but from visualization, have you seen bats coordinating their feeding activities? There are some birds where we've got recordings of collaboration with hunts. In the mammal bird in the bat world, is there similar behavior where they can coordinate and then obviously track the communication they use?
I'm not aware of any example outside of mother and pup communication, where there is a series of social calls that are only ever recorded when a mum is flying with the newly flying pup and kind of showing it the ropes of this is how you catch mosquitoes, basically. And so there's this unique series of calls that will be used to keep in touch with the pup as it flies. I'm not aware of the. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just but the research on social calls is quite limited in most places. Yeah.
And how about the work on uniquely identifying the mother pup calls to then help identify unique calls anyway? The pup must be able to identify.
Yes.
So have we worked out how they do that?
I don't think so. No. Also, the when you look at certain roosts, I've been in roosts in Kenya with 1 million bats. How does the mum go back to the pup? I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. So many things that we don't know.
Do you need here to have any kind of permissions to be able to put these recorders?
Yes. I haven't always done that because I'm not always aware of who to ask and things. But yes, I have been informed that some of the data I shouldn't have, but yeah, I don't really publish most of it because of the sorts of issues. But so I'm always happy to just sort things out if needed, and then we can perhaps collaborate and actually make this collaborative project, regardless of kind of where the data comes from or who recorded it. Because to me, it doesn't matter who placed the recorder, because it's just a box. So yeah, it's kind of.
What about Europe? Do you need any permissions when you do it in the UK, for example?
Not really. I mean, as long as it's not private land. If it is, then you need obviously. Not really, no. I've had this weird thing where recording bats around the world was, in most places, it's considered research. So you need a research permit. You need usually a different visa. Recording birds is not research. It's just a hobby. So I thought, hang on a minute. So there is still that bit of a grey area where bat acoustics are considered to be, I don't know, high-tech research. When you've got people showing up with dish parables, recording birds anywhere, and that's fine. It's just it's hobby, you know. That bothers me a little, which is why I tend to be a little bit cavalier with where I record bats. But sort of beyond making sure it's not private land, So
how many are how many species of bats we have here?
So officially,
including the one which you found, you said it was not
officially 9, because the 2015 review has 9. There was a report that came out in 2018 that listed a couple more. Then from recordings I've seen from myself and colleagues, it's about 12 currently, with 2 or 3 suspected species that could also occur that have only so far been found in Oman, but be surprising if they weren't here. So it could go up to 15.
You were saying about the data, it's useful to sort of get more data on bats here. Is it useful for people in the group if we happen to be out somewhere more remote, that if we see bats around, should we see them? Is it useful to get in touch with you to let you know about it or not? It's not really.
It's tricky to do anything with that information. If it is a roost, then absolutely yes, even if you don't know what it is. Because then someone can go and check. If it's just about flying, there's not much that we can do about that. Because even if you had pictures, I get sent pictures of blurry pictures of bats in flight all the time. Because the issue is you have no sense of scale. The person says, "Oh, it was this size," but I found that that's rarely accurate. I've seen pipistrelles, which are based everywhere here or in Europe. The wingspan is about like this. The body is about like this. You'll tell people, "No, I saw a bat like this," and then you actually look at it and no,
Something suddenly comes at night and you
Or-
see.
yeah. Or people are used to seeing them at night, and then suddenly they see it during the day, so it's so much bigger. No, it's just the light that's the. So you know, there's limited things that we can do with that information, but I do hope that at some point we can maybe get people involved in perhaps placing bat recorders in different places, so that it's not just a couple of us who have to travel around the country to deploy recorders, but we can do a more collaborative data collection thing, which has worked really well in other countries. They just started one in New Zealand, for example. There's one that's been very successful in the UK. So yeah, who knows? Maybe one day we can look into that. Yep.
So from what I understand, different species, they fly at different altitudes, right? So
Kind of. So different species will eat different things. They will have different hunting styles. So there's the desert longit, for example. I don't have pictures of it, sadly. And I refuse to use any of the pictures that are online because they're all from poorly held bat species. They're held in a way that shouldn't be held. Anyway, they tend to grab stuff off the ground. So they're known to eat scorpions, for example. So they'll fly very low to the ground. I've had one fly this in between my legs, this at this height. They're completely white, so even at night, you know exactly what you're looking at. They fly very slowly and they're mostly listening for movement on the sand. And then you've got species that fly very fast, very high. I mean, you've got you might have seen species fly around streetlights in UAE. So that's another flight style. Some species have learned to use streetlights to forage as well, because it's a free buffet.
So I assume that they're just hunting the insects, moths or something, which is fine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But what is the maximum altitude which is known for any species? Like how high they can fly?
We don't know
Because
because
you know.
it's very hard to measure this. But there was a study done in Belgium where they tagged a species of noctule, so a fairly large bat, sort of this kind of wingspan, body like this. About the smallest you can fit a GPS tag on. A GPS tag is pretty accurate in terms of X and Y positions, so longitude, latitude. So as altitude, that's kind of where things fall apart a bit. And so the error range is usually said to be plus or minus 50 meters. 50, yeah. So if you're trying to look at, say, interactions with wind turbines that are deployed at 100 meters, you don't know if it's 50 meters above, 50 meters below, it doesn't really work. But they did get things at 1,000 meters, which is between 950 and 1050, if you account. At this point, the 50 meters are irrelevant because 1,000 meters is still really, really high. And it wasn't a glitch because it was actually ramped up and ramped down. So that's how you can tell, okay, this seems to be accurate. But we didn't know that before. It was, I know they've shown it on other species. That they have shown it in the US as well, on the Brazilian freetails, about similar heights. So who knows? We might have the same here on the naked-bellied tombbat, which is also very high-flying, very fast species that has kind of similar ecology to something like Brazilian freetails, forages in similar way. So why not? You know, might also have them at 1,000 meters. Yeah.
From my experience in UAE, the most bats I've seen roosting have been in the heritage buildings. And whilst that could be a opportunistic place to place because they're roosting to capture some of their movement, that would introduce bias if you were only to use that. But it could be one way of finding.
Yeah, but it's been pretty well shown that, especially in arid areas, they use a lot of human-made structures. So this would be either buildings that are still in use or older buildings. You see this a lot. I mean, it's no secret. So, for example, if you look at ancient Egypt, the bats are everywhere in temples now. And I have this thing where bats are not super common in Egyptian mythology. They're there, but they're not super present. So when you look at how common they are now in temples, clearly they might not have been that common back then, or maybe it was just part of that scenario. I don't know. There's something there which has always fascinated me about sort of when did the bats move in, you know? Because now they're everywhere. In the whole Nile Valley, you go to any site, it's going to have bats.
And
It's
what-
kind of true for a lot of the abandoned buildings in most places.
What's the first documented recordings that we have of bats being studied, or
That I don't know.
because I would have thought that would be different around the world
It probably is,
for
yeah, for sure.
all sorts of reasons.
But most of the bat species from Europe, for example, were described in sort of 1750 around there. But that doesn't mean that we have all the records of bats. So, for example, if you look into the mythology of vampires and look at sort of how those stories developed over the years, vampires, the way they were describing in Eastern Europe, haven't always fed on blood. That seems to be something that was added on as Europeans came back from the Neotropics, so South America, describing this behavior, and it got kind of merged in with the vampire stories. So clearly there was already awareness of bats there, which was quite a bit before 1750, I believe. But honestly, I don't really know that much. I believe in medieval illustrations, there's quite a few bats in there. So,
Any recipes? No, just joking.
sorry?
Any recipes?
No, I've seen bat curry, I've not tried it.
I think the DVCR has bats as well.
Yes, it does. Yes, I've done quite a bit of work with them there. They always seem excited when I show up there to put some nets or some recorders, and because we always discover something really interesting. And this is one place, for example, where I really want to do radio tracking. So I know this is one place where they have desert long-eared bats. Before these recordings, the only record was from a owl pellet somewhere in Hasarkama, I think. But now we have recordings from there. The habitat is great, but it would be interesting to see how far they travel, where they roost, because there's no rock crevices there. There's a few rock formations in the far north of the reserve, but elsewhere there's a few abandoned buildings, or maybe there we don't really know.
They do not use gut trees. But you're saying that sometimes it goes for some trees.
They might use gaff trees, because I've noticed that the bark does become very loose over time. So there is a gap, because they don't seem to have many holes, the gaff trees, but they do seem to have loose bark, which is used by certain species, at least in Europe, where there's a whole book on bat roosts in trees. It's amazing. I wish we could do this, hey. So that is an option. I've also been wondering about palm trees. I know it's a big thing in the US, where there's big campaigns. I don't know when people cut their palm, the old fronds, but there's big campaigns, communication campaigns to tell people to make sure that they're not disturbing bats that might be roosting in there. And this is especially interesting, for example, in the city of Dubai, where I see cool speedy trails in quite random places. Buildings as they are built in Dubai don't seem to have many roosting features like you would have in older construction, say in Europe, with the roof that doesn't quite fit, the bricks that don't quite fit, nothing fits. Here it's all concrete blocks, it doesn't really work. So perhaps they roost in palm trees and in the sort of the dead fronds around the crown. I don't know, I've never seen it, but it's been shown in other countries, so hey, why not, you know?
Probably in sheds. Probably in sheds or things like that, and they have different rooms too.
Yeah. I mean, there's this big thing where bats in September are found in parasols throughout Europe and the US. Why parasols? I don't know. But I think it's September because that's when people perhaps close them or open them depending on the season. And that's also a time of migration. So bats are probably looking for temporary roosts. There's so many different wacky roosts that we are learning about every day. So yeah, it's really interesting to kind of think about what could be. Yeah.
No, I was always seeing, sorry.
So I have some very naive question. Where do bats live in the UAE? They live in the cave or in building?
That's the thing we don't really know. Could be trees, could be. It's definitely caves and tunnels, things like that. Because we've seen them. We've had pictures. You just show me a picture. But this does not account for the diversity or the activity that we are noticing with acoustics, for example. If I go to the ECR, I've never seen a roosting bat in that place. I get so many bat calls, and I've caught so many bats there. I don't know where they come from. I just don't. And I don't think many people know. If you look at the literature, it's the same line. It just says abandoned buildings, crevices in rocks, caves.
So,
But it's very vague, and it's usually based on maybe 15 records. That there's also a bit of a bias where bats in buildings, bats in tunnels are easy to see because you just walk there, you see them. Crevices, it's a lot harder. Other features, say palm trees, no one ever walks up a palm tree to look at bats. They do chop them, which might be interesting to talk to people to see if they see bats. But yeah, it's basically we don't know what we don't know.
2 more questions.
Yeah.
Another, is it, so what I understood is different type of bats, they have a different song.
Yes.
So you can tell what kind of bats they are.
Yes.
Just the recording sound.
Not all the time, but yes, that is the goal. Yes.
The last lecture we had this lecture about the empty quarter. I'd like to know if there's that it could possible have bats live there, or it's too hot. Or
I've had bats in the Omani empty quarter. Anytime you have any kind of, usually around the human settlements, because that's when you have water reservoirs, a few palm trees usually, but an oasis might work. Human settlements are really artificial oases in a way. I don't think that in actual sort of in a sea of dunes you would get anything, but who knows? Who knows?
we did the walk through Mahafis, you know the Malaya Road, the 102. You take 611 north
Yes,
to the massive Sharjah Mall, turn
Yes.
right.
yes,
Before you get to Malayha, there's
Yes.
turn right to I think it's Mahafis. But they don't go at night. Yes, or Fire Road. Anyway, there's an area basically the side of you. It's orange sand. There's some very red rocky outcrops, quite high.
yeah. I think I know what you mean. Yeah.
Stinging berries. So at night, we were Gary, and there were what looked to be very big bats, as you say, how big is big, but there was a lot of activity there.
Interesting.
And whereas they roost, it's just rocks, really. But they might fly in the way that bumblebees are recorded to fly from one place crazy distances and come back and keep doing it. Is there any evidence that bats have some kind of repetitive long distance paths like that?
Yeah. So from radio tracking studies, I mean, the latest wacky one was from a few months ago. They tagged a bat in, I believe it was Belgium that they tagged it in. The bat went to England and then to France in a night. It crossed the channel twice in a night. So you might think, okay, the bat was cold, was a little bit disoriented, was a little bit stressed. Still, crossing the channel twice in a night seems a little bit excessive as a reaction to being trapped.
Seems more like a spy mechanism.
It's the one in,
Yeah.
one out policy, British government.
Didn't seem to care. They were actually quite happy about it.